to a familiar story, and I hope to give you some new information, something you maybe haven't thought of, and maybe connect the dots. And what I'm doing is kind of going into more detail. A few weeks ago when I did the sermon on life principles, last week I highlighted one of those, and today I want to highlight another one. In Exodus 14, it's simply the story of the parting of the Red Sea, the Israel leaving Egypt and heading for the Promised Land, and the first major obstacle that they would have to face with God on their side. And I know you're really familiar with the story. I thought I was familiar with the story. In college, the professors, some of which I don't believe have ever entered a church, changed the story on me. They said, well, it wasn't the Red Sea, it was the Reed Sea. And the Reed Sea is a very shallow crossing bog that I suppose they believed that the million or so Israelites with all their animals and belongings could cross there quite easily. The wind blowing at the time to, I don't know, give them a tailwind to help them across. And anyway, he said, well, this is the way it really is, despite what you've been told in church. And one of the students there said, well, if this is true, how is it that the Israeli army, the Egyptian army drowned in a foot of water? So he had to rethink his position a little bit. But basically, when they're trying to teach you something against what you already know about the Bible, if you know the Bible well enough, you'll know that their theory doesn't pan out. Because there's a reason why the Egyptians had to drown. And that's the point I want to make today. Verses 1 and 2, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, tell the sons of Israel to turn back and camp before this big old long word, between Migdal and the sea. You shall camp in front of Baal Zephon, opposite it, by the sea. So God told them exactly where to go and exactly where to camp. 10 through 13. As Pharaoh drew near, he decided, why did we let them go? They were doing all of our hard work. Let's pursue them and bring them back. As Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they became very frightened. So the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. And then they said to Moses, is it because there are not enough graves in Egypt you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in this wilderness. And then finally, verse 16, when Moses, Moses said, the Lord will fight for you. Just, let's see, this is verse 14. So keep silent. The Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. To go forward means into the sea. So is God marching his people into the sea to see how long they can tread water? As for you, Moses, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land. Now it says, I didn't read the whole thing. It says the wind blew strong all night long. So Moses divided the sea. What was the purpose of the wind?
To help divide the sea.
Keep the water.
It's going to be muddy. The bottom of the sea has been wet for a very long time. So the wind dried the bottom of the sea so they could march on through to the other side. So when they saw the Egyptians, and they assumed the Egyptians were just going to kill them all right there for leaving. When they saw the Egyptians, they cried out to Moses, and they started blaming him. You see, this is a typical blame the preacher situation from day one until the very end of the book. The cloud, which covered them, protecting them. They're in a desert, literally a desert. So the cloud protected them. Huge cloud kept the sun from directly just baking them and making them so dehydrated they couldn't function. So the cloud moved from top to behind them. It's like a giant fog. And the army going to attack them that night wandered all over the place, couldn't find them because God was confusing the army and keeping them away until the wind had dried up the mud and the sea was rising up on both sides of them. And that was verse 19. So lift your staff and command the sea to divide. Now, if Moses had just lifted up his staff and commanded the sea to divide without God's authority, nothing would have happened. But if God tells you to do something, you can count on it happening. So he lifted up his staff because being obedient is the first step. Listening to God probably is the first step. Being obedient is the second step. And then the sea divided. And so the wind blew all night. The next morning they began to cross into the Red Sea and out the other side. The cloud lifted, and they once again saw the army coming after them. Verse 7, Pharaoh, when he decided to go after them, he selected 600 choice chariots. That would be his entourage. And then all the rest of the chariots. And all of the army. They didn't hold any back to guard the city. I mean, everybody went after the Israelites. So now they enter the dry, divided sea after the Israelites. The Israelites come out, the last one came out on the other side, and then the walls of water on both sides caved in, trapping the entire Egyptian army underwater inside the Red Sea. So, verse 28, the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, even Pharaoh's entire army that had gone into the sea, not even one of them remained. So, God had drowned the young men of Egypt. Now, if you think in terms of you reap what you sow, then the Egyptians, Pharaoh, must have sowed something at some time to reap that kind of reward. And if you think back in the story to Moses' beginning, it says, Exodus 1 and 22, Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is to be born to the Israelites you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. And he had originally told the midwives that if a son is born, you kill him on the spot and tell him, well, he died in birth. But the midwives refused to do it. They didn't want to go against Israel's God. So they said, well, they're so strong that they would have their children before we could get to them. So then he came out with, okay, that's enough of this midwife nonsense. Everybody is going to find a child of the Hebrews and throw him in the Nile. That's a command from Pharaoh. So the sowing that he did was killing the young children, boy children of Israel by drowning. So the reaping was God 80 years later drowning the young men of Egypt in the Nile. You see how that reaping and sowing?
Yep.
Okay. So if you're seeing that connection, God says, treasure the children. Do not make them sacrifices. He told this in Leviticus long before Israel ever dreamed of sacrificing their children to Molech or any of the gods, of putting their children in the fire or sacrificing them in any way. This was a law, and they knew it. They had memorized the first 5 books of our Bible is their Bible, and they had memorized that, and so they knew better, and yet they did it anyway. And God said, if you do that, terrible things will come upon you. Jeremiah said, perhaps even a plague, and God has not changed in any way. I didn't write down the Jeremiah scriptures for you, but I can find it if you need it. So giving you a modern example of revenge for the destruction of children, Jonathan Cahn, one of my favorite authors, Jewish rabbi and Christian prophet, reported in his book, The Oracle, and I don't know how many of you might have stumbled across it or have a copy of it. In New York, January of 1970, that is when Roe Wade was implemented by the Supreme Court. That's when the countdown began. Legalization of abortion. In the Exodus story, it was 80 years between the drowning of the children and the drowning of the army. Now it would be 50 years between God beginning the countdown, I would say, from the Supreme Court allowing the destruction of children legally. 50 years later, a plague came upon New York, January 20th, to the day that the Supreme Court made that pronouncement. 50 years later, to the day, COVID hit New York. New York being the world capital of abortion. So Rabbi Cahn did extensive research on this and found that the death count for the COVID was about the same as the death count of aborted babies at that time. And if you let that kind of soak in, things seem like people get away with things because years and years and years, decades go by, and yet God doesn't forget. So whether you think it's a coincidence or whether you think that is a reaping and sowing situation, there are so many of these stories in Scripture. If we're reading through Exodus, it's kind of hard to put together something that happened in the beginning of Exodus as we reach the end of Exodus or the middle of Exodus. But if you kind of keep in mind that how these things are connected, how they are put together, and what lessons we are to learn from these stories, they're not just entertainment. There's something there that we can learn and we can apply to our lives. I have a book, The Oracle. I couldn't find it. And I was telling Sandy I wanted to use this story, but I couldn't find my book. And of course she says, Google it. So, so she Googled it, and sure enough, all the information that was in Jonathan Cahn's book was there on Google. Of course, it's stated like Jonathan Cahn believes this, Jonathan Cahn said this, like that. So it's up to you whether you want to believe there's a connection there or not. But that's all that I had prepared for you today. It's hard for me to concentrate this past week, but I appreciate everybody, and Merry Christmas.